All right, I wanted to record the notes for you if you missed class because of the ACT. So this is the beginning of our LT1 notes. We started with what is the nervous system? And so we often talk about the nervous system's primary function as a control center, and that is very much true, but I would also like to add to that control function coordination. So it's a control and coordination center. And for example, things that need to be controlled and coordinated within our body, thoughts for sure, and the thinking that can lead to action. Emotion has a bit of control and coordination. And then, of course, homeostasis, which we talked about quite a bit at the beginning of the year. We have to regulate or coordinate and control various processes in our body to sustain life. Things like blood pressure and heart rate and respiration, all of that is factored into that last word, homeostasis there. So when we look at what does the nervous system really do, it's detecting as a part of the control and coordination. It's detecting something. It is sort of sending what has been detected to an integration or a processing center, and then we can respond. And so this diagram is in your chart, and this diagram shows that basic pathway. And we'll look at it here in just a second. But notice that we are detecting out in our body, collecting information from sensory input. So things like light and touch and sound and smell and taste, all of that is being detected. It's being sent to the brain for an integration process, and then we respond to what we have detected. And responses are going to essentially stimulate some kind of a muscle in our body. I mean, that's how we're really doing things, actively doing things. It's by way of muscle contractions. So in this diagram, we can add those parts of the overall process. So the detection piece comes by way of sensory neurons. The integration piece comes by way of neurons that are in the brain and spinal cord. And the response piece comes by way of motor neurons that are landing out on a muscle. And that muscle contracting produces some kind of movement. It might be skeletal muscle movement, which then moves our body. It might be smooth muscle movement, which controls a lot of those sort of internal visceral processes like digestion and urination and reproduction. But the ultimate response aspect is going to be because a motor neuron stimulates a muscle. Now, next we moved on to the two divisions of the nervous system, and this came from the the intro assignment that I gave you on Google Classroom prior to us sitting down to take notes. So the nervous system is broken down into two primary branches. The central nervous system, or the CNS, contains our brain and our spinal cord, which is found sealed in the dorsal body cavity. Now remember, dorsal body cavity, dorsal as a term means back or towards the back, and we saw this dorsal body cavity at the beginning of the year. This cavity should be sealed, and it should be pretty sterile and protected. There is some fluid that's circulating around our brain and spine in this cavity, but by and large, it should be sealed, sterile, and protected. The CNS is on the previous diagram where we saw the integration and processing component of the nervous system's function. Now, the other division of the nervous system is the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. And that includes nerves that come off of your central nervous system. So spinal nerves, cranial nerves that then go out into the body. Now, based on the video that you watched and the questions that you answered from the Google Classroom assignment, you know that the peripheral nervous system is broken down into sensory divisions and motor divisions. And so sensory division includes those sensory neurons, which take information to the brain and spinal cord. I'm tagging in this word afferent with an A because we saw that at the beginning of the year. Afferent is another word that describes a sensory neuron that is carrying information towards the brain or spine. The motor division contains motor neurons, which are efferent or efferent neurons. That's going to carry information from the central nervous system back out to the body. Again, connecting it to that diagram that we saw, it's going to land on a muscle. Here's just kind of an interesting dissection of both the central nervous system, brain, and spine. And then you can see some spinal nerves radiating. Cranial nerves are a little harder to see up here on the brain and the brain stem, but a lovely dissection piece here. Then we moved on into the types of nerves. So you have a chart in your notes. The primary nerve type is called a neuron. And so we'll talk about some characteristics of this primary type. And then everything else falls into a category called neuroglial cells. They are supportive of the basic, the primary neuron here. So everything else is sort of a helper, helping this neuron function to the best of its ability. So a neuron is the most highly specialized cell in your body. It looks kind of crazy and funky, and its structure is really designed specific to its function. A couple of special characteristics of classic neurons: they are amitotic, which means that they don't divide, they don't go through mitosis. They are locked in that phase or stage of the cell cycle that is called G0. And so if you damage them, they're not going to replace themselves. There are some exceptions to this. You have some neurons in your nose, and you have some neurons in your brain that are associated with memory in your hippocampus that can regenerate in a sense. And so by and large, I say they're amitotic, but always remember there are exceptions to every rule. So the bummer is if you damage them, you lose them. But the good news is if you take care of them, they actually live a long time. And so neurons have incredible longevity in the cellular world. So think about some skin cells turn over every couple of days. And here you have neurons that could last your entire life if you care for them. Neurons have a very high metabolic rate. That means that they need a constant supply of energy. And the easiest way to make energy is in the presence of oxygen, right? We know about aerobic respiration coming off the heels of our muscle system. And so you need oxygen supplied to your brain to create the ATP that is needed to supply the metabolic needs of your neurons. That means if you don't have oxygen flowing to these neurons, they will die pretty quickly. And remember, if they die, they're gone. All right, this next piece, I would like for you to pause the video, and I want for you to draw this basic structure. Now, you don't have to draw in a perfect picture, but you want the basic shape of a neuron, and then you want to label all of the things over here. So pause the video, label, and then unpause. If you've unpaused, you probably realize that there are two words on this list that are not on the diagram. So let's talk about the axon hillock for a second, and then we'll talk about the nodes of Ranvier. So the axon hillock is this little segment right here just before we talk about the axon or we see the axon. So kind of circle this area. It is where the soma or the cell body connects to the actual axon. That's called the axon hillock. It's the very top part of the axon that becomes important in sort of deciding whether or not the nerve is going to fire in action potential. The other thing, the nodes of Ranvier, the nodes, and this diagram doesn't do a great job of showing, there's a little bit of axon exposed between each of these blobs. So each of these blobs is an extension of a cell that is a neighboring cell, a supporting cell that's creating some myelin. And in between, there are little sections of the underlying axon that are exposed. And those exposed segments are called the nodes of Ranvier. So you could label anywhere in between these cells. Those are all nodes. Now let's talk about our supporting cell. So neuroglial cells, there are several different kinds of neuroglial cells. So this will kind of finish out our chart. This first type of neuroglial cell that you can see a picture of is called an oligodendrocyte. And it kind of looks like an eyeball. It's a sphere and you see a dot in the middle. That dot is actually the soma of the oligodendrocyte, and then you have all of these projections coming off of it. This is a cell that creates the myelin around the axons of the neurons in the central nervous system. So these cells will wrap themselves around axons in the CNS to create that structure that you just drew and labeled called myelin. In the peripheral nervous system, myelin is created by a different kind of neuroglial cell that is called a Schwann cell. And I would write that down, although it's not reflected on this PowerPoint. Schwann, Schwann, the Schwann cell creates the myelin around the nerves in the PNS. Next cell type we have is called an astrocyte. So that astro as a prefix maybe makes you think of astrology or astronomy. And really that's part of its name. It's a star-like cell. And so you have the cell body right here, and then you have all of these little sort of projections, these arms coming off. This is the most abundant support cell in your nervous system. And really, it is there to anchor neighboring cells and structures together. So it reaches out with its arms and it holds neurons next to neighboring neurons that will talk to each other. It might hold a neuron next to a capillary for blood flow. So this is a structural helper, keeping cells that need to be in structures that need to be close by in proximity to each other. The next cell type we have are called microglial cells. And so micro as a prefix makes us think small or tiny, and that's exactly true. And so you see the little kind of purple dots in here, those are all cell bodies, and the green are extensions from those microglial cells. They look like spiders with big, long legs. They function like an immune system for our nervous system. So this is like a little private immune system dedicated towards detecting pathogens and engulfing them or eating up the invaders that might be in and around our nervous system. The last cell type is called an ependymal cell. And so specifically the ependymal cells are these pink cells right here. And they really don't look like any of the other cells that we've seen in the nervous system. They look like cells that we saw back when we talked about skin. And that's because they really actually are a type of epithelial cell. They line the dorsal body cavity. So they line the cavity where the central nervous system is enclosed. And they do a couple of things. They're going to make a liquid that will surround and protect the brain and the spine. And they're going to provide an actual barrier to prevent things from being able to cross over and impact your central nervous system. That barrier is often referred to as the blood-brain barrier. Some medications, some pharmaceuticals, some drugs, street drugs, cross the blood-brain barrier and give us a sort of neurological response or effect. Others specifically do not cross the blood-brain barrier, and that is protective, particularly pharmaceuticals, prescription medications, that is protective of our central nervous system. So that was really quick, but that should get you caught up. This was the first set of notes that we took back together in class when you were done with the ACT. So you are finished.